Hello. Welcome. Good morning. My name is Sally Myers. I've been here at Cedarfield with my husband Rick for 3.5 years, and I'm not going to talk about that. That's been very nice. Um, Before that, we lived in Henrico County, really Goochland County. Uh, but what's really important, the date is 1975, when we moved from St. Louis, the Midwest, where we lived all our lives, to Richmond, Virginia. And I got smacked in the face with the Civil War. Um, we went to school like Nelson did in Indiana, although he went to the big school. We went to DePaul. But when we lived in Ohio right after that, I taught in the Columbus Public Schools. And if you taught in the public schools in Columbus, you could go to Ohio State for free. And so for 3 years, I went to graduate school and got a graduate degree in history, which sort of changed my life. And it was like a nice surprise. After that, we were in Edwards Air Force Base, where I got the pleasure of teaching American history in 1971 and 72, being a big opponent of the Vietnam War. But now I'm teaching airmen, and Buzz Aldrin is at the base. So I don't say a whole lot about Vietnam, except what positive things I can. And then back at St. Louis and Flo Valley. And the reason I'm telling you this is when we moved to Richmond in 1975, it was natural to immediately start teaching at J. Sargent Reynolds. And the junior college system is just wonderful. But I was smacked in the face with a different view of the Civil War. I didn't even know what the lost cause was, but I found out. And during this time, I also volunteered as a docent at the Historical Society. So I met Charlie Bryan and Nelson. And also during this time, leading up to Nelson's book, I remember in the 1990s, it was such a wonderful time to teach American history because the Cold War was over, the world was perfect, and someone wrote a book called April 1865 that not every part of the world was perfect. There were civil wars going on in the Balkans. And Jay Winnicks thought about this, and he said, why did the American Civil War end so softly and other civil wars do not? Now, I think Nelson might take issue with that, and the people that lived in April 1865 to 1869 would take issue with that. They were afraid and they were hungry. But anyway, so it's not that simple. It was a nice thought about the United States. He said the reason the American Civil War ended so softly was because of three men, Lincoln, Grant, and Lee. They wanted the South to come down soft. And that did mean the war was not perpetuated as it does in other places, but not everybody wins in that kind of situation. Anyway, Nelson has written many books. He's been an editor down at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture for 30 years, and his book is wonderful. I was just telling him, having taught history all these years, I didn't know all of that about Jefferson Davis. I knew a little bit, but not all of it, so I learned a lot. So, Nelson, and just to show that this is still relevant, what was in the paper this week that Abigail Spanberger signed a law saying that we can no longer get license plates that say that you're a veteran of the Confederacy. So it goes on and on. Okay. All right. I'll use this for questions. Okay, Nelson.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally. Can everyone hear me? Back row? Great. Well, it's wonderful to be here, and wow, to see so many people turn out for a morning lecture, and so many friends, especially Charlie Bryan. Charlie and I have been in the wars for 30 plus years at the Virginia Historical Society, now the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, but it's great to have Charlie here and so many other friends. Well, my book, After the Fire, is a story about Richmond and its people after the Civil War, especially the first pivotal year. It's now a vanished world of defeat and jubilation, of destruction and rebuilding, and of enduring racial divide. That first year ended with two strikingly different public events that showed the differing ways the black and white communities remembered the war and interpreted it. But first, because this book is a sequel to my earlier book, Richmond Burning, let's burn the city down again. Some of you may remember this print, it's a Currier and Ives print that was very popular in the North, showing the defeat of the South. It's a bit fanciful, but it gives you the idea of the drama. You all know the story. April the 2nd, 1865, the Southern government abandons its capital. The rebel army retreats. The warehouses and bridges burn. The business district goes up in flames. The Union Army marches in. Slavery ends, and Abraham Lincoln himself walks through the smoking ruins one day later. Doesn't get much more dramatic than that. At dawn on Monday, April the 3rd, a strong wind blew from the south and blew flaming embers over the doomed wooden rooftops of Richmond's factories and dwellings. Residents sought shelter on the green of Capitol Square. Frank Lawley, a correspondent for the London Times, was there. And in his last dispatch, he quoted Shakespeare's Tempest. Hell is empty and all the devils are here. Elizabeth Van Lew, a Union spy, watched from her mansion on Church Hill. The inferno, she said, fill the sky with clouds of smoke as incense from the land for its deliverance. What a moment, avenging wrath appeased in flames. Confederate artillery officer Edward Porter Alexander watched from temporary safety of the south bank of the river. He had a different point of view. It was a sad, a terrible, and a solemn sight, he said years later. He wrote those words with a detachment he couldn't have felt at the time. I rode on, he wrote, with a distinctly heavy heart and with a peculiar sort of feeling of orphanage. Journalist Thomas Chester marched in with regiments of the United States Colored Troops, the USCTs. It's showing here. There we go.
I don't know what happened. All right. Let's see.
All
See
right.
if you're able to advance the slides.
Okay, we'll go back.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. All right. Let me start over again with Chester. He was a Philadelphia journalist, and he marched in with a regiment of the United States Colored Troops, and he said he just marveled at what he called the great concourse of American citizens of African descent who welcomed their liberators. Garland White had fled slavery and returned that day as a chaplain with a USCT regiment. Like these men, most of whom were recruited from Virginia. When they reached the western edge of town, his comrades asked him to speak to the freed people who gathered around them. He got as far as proclaiming freedom to all mankind before choking up with emotion. Then some soldiers brought an old woman from the crowd to speak to him. After quizzing him, she said, "This is your mother, Garland, who has spent 20 years of grief about her son." A true story. When I first read it, I didn't believe it, but I found a letter that he wrote to the editor of his newspaper 1 week after that dramatic event. Union soldiers would argue for years to come about who raised the first American flag over the Capitol. In fact, it wasn't a soldier in blue who raised the flag. It was a pale-skinned, biracial Richmond youth, Richard Gill Forrester. That morning, there was the fire of Richmond, but there was no Battle of Richmond. the Union Army marched in unopposed. General Godfrey Weitzel led his soldiers into town. He took up a position on the portico of the Capitol. One of his staff said they looked down on a gigantic crater of fire. One Confederate woman said, "It was my idea of the Day of Judgment. I feel as if God had hidden his face from us as a nation." By afternoon, spans of the railroad bridges began dropping into the river with great hissing splashes. The fire died down by evening. That night, a secessionist editor who was still in town wrote bitterly that a strange quiet fell upon the blackened city, the quiet of a great desolation. And here you can see the tobacco warehouses where Confederate soldiers first lit the fire. In the following weeks, photographers swarmed over the city. They captured the ruins in hundreds of glass plate negatives like this. From 8th Street to 15th Street, all you could see were blackened walls and smoking ruins. April the 3rd overshadowed everything that had come before in the city's history, and it influenced everything that followed for years to come. One of my favorite pictures shows Union cavalry horses tied up to the fence at the base of Capitol Square with the ruins of the burnt district beyond. And this famous photo shows two women in deep mourning dress gliding past the burned out ruins of a building. Union topographical engineers began to create this map before the fire had cooled. You can see Capitol Square in the middle, surrounded by the curved walks through the gardens of the square. And down below the square, and all those gray blocks cross-hatched in gray, that was the site of the fire. People were already calling it the burnt district. But only 1/10 of the city burned. And yet, that consisted of 9/10 of the jobs and the wealth, so they all went up in smoke. In all, more than 2/3 of the South's assessed value vanished. Richmond faced the daunting task of rebuilding because of the lack of capital and uncertainty about ownership of property. And the earliest economic activity wasn't exactly the most desirable. Gambling dens, saloons, and brothels. Not surprisingly, crime increased. More grievous than these material losses was the human cost. Across the state, 40,000 Virginians died. That was 3% of the population. For weeks, a dramatic demographic flux characterized the city. Confederate veterans flooded in seeking transport home to other southern states, like these men lounging around the base of the George Washington statue on Capitol Square. Black people streamed in from outlying counties, like this family sitting on the banks of the canal with the ruins of Gallego Mill behind them. They came in search of food, of jobs, and of family members separated by the slave auctions of Richmond. Sorry about that. Let's see. Okay, thank you. April 1865 brought not just physical destruction, but the complete upending of society, a great inversion of the way Richmonders viewed their world. It meant uncertainty for Confederates, for white Unionists, and for black people. Who would rule in the Virginia capital? What rights could the formerly enslaved expect, and what terrible verdict from the triumphant North awaited the defeated Confederates? This is a time of intense antagonism, hostility between minority white Unionists and majority Confederates, friction between the Army and local elites, and discord between black and white Richmonders. Former Governor and rebel General Henry Alexander Wise spoke for many Confederates. His hard features gave him the look of a haunted, dangerous man. He was erratic, conceited, and slovenly. He dribbled tobacco juice down the front of his shirt as he spoke. But he was a politician of undeniable charm and hypnotic power. He'd hang John Brown at Harper's Ferry and almost single-handedly dragged Virginia to secede. A Union chaplain quizzed him at Appomattox. When Wise denied he'd helped cause the war, the chaplain said he deserved to hang. "You cannot subjugate us," Wise shot back. "God is with us. The great heart of the South remains unconquered." The most bitter opponent of Northern victory was agricultural reformer Edmund Ruffin. This long-haired apostle of secession had fired the signal cannon that began the bombardment of Fort Sumter 4 years before. In his last diary entry, he declared his unmitigated hatred to Yankee rule. With that angry benediction, he put his mouth over the barrel of his rifle and with a forked stick depressed the trigger. The small number of white Unionists in Richmond feared being overwhelmed by the majority of Confederates. Former Congressman John Minor Botts was a large man. He had a massive head and a bombastic style of speaking. He graced a Confederate jail for his Unionist opinions. When asked to work with former Confederates to rebuild the state government, he refused. In a letter, he seethed, "They and I can never, never, never be politically associated together." During the war, an alternative state government, domiciled in Northern Virginia and loyal to Washington, waited for the chance to come to Richmond. The governor was Francis Harrison Pierpont. A shrewd lawyer, he despised slaveholding aristocrats. He led the effort to separate the mountain counties from the Confederate East and create West Virginia. His government arrived in Richmond in May. It rested on the small number of white Unionists. At this point, black people were still excluded from politics. Pierpont hoped to bring the white factions together, Unionist and Confederate, to form a middle way between extremes. But he didn't reckon on the powerful hatreds that made that goal unlikely. If he'd had the gift of prophecy, he might not have come to Richmond. On the national scene, no one knew what President Andrew Johnson's policy for Reconstruction would be. At first, it seemed ominous for Confederates. 6 weeks after Lincoln's assassination, Johnson issued a proclamation. It pardoned ordinary Confederates if they took an oath of allegiance, but it excluded from that generosity all prominent Confederates and anyone worth more than $20,000. That sent a shiver down the spines of Southern elites. Moreover, 2 days after Johnson's proclamation, the first efforts to indict leading Confederates and confiscate their property began. That effort was led by John Underwood. Before the war, he'd earned notoriety as one of the few Virginians to support Lincoln. This disheveled-looking federal judge became the most hated figure in the demonology of white Richmonders. While they feared for their property, black Richmonders feared for their freedom. Would the promise of emancipation be denied to them? What prompted that fear was the reinstatement of Mayor Joseph Carrington Mayo. He was a stiff autocrat whose out-of-date fashion sense matched his antiquated opinions. Mayo restored the whipping post for minor offenses. He enforced the Army's pass system that required black people to carry a pass signed by a white person. In response, a black delegation even went to the White House to protest. Mayo was removed from office, and at the same time, the Army appointed a new general for Virginia, Alfred Terry. He showed more sympathy for black citizens. He ended the hated pass system, and he declared, quote, People of color will henceforth enjoy the same personal liberty as other citizens and inhabitants enjoy. But could he enforce that statement? The first 4th of July after the fire illustrated the divisions between black and white Richmonders. The Army organized a parade down Broad Street to Capitol Square with brass bands and artillery salutes. At the square, Dr. Mary Walker read the Declaration of Independence. She was a pioneering woman physician, but she was better known for campaigning for comfortable fashions for women. Most of those who attended the ceremony were black. White Richmonders pointedly stayed away and did not hear Dr. Walker speak. A sharp change of fortune for white Richmond came by the end of the summer when President Johnson made a stunning reversal in his policy. Here he is again, still looking sour. Earlier, he burned the poor man's hatred of the Southern white elite, but he came to realize he needed them if he wanted to be elected in his own right. So he began to issue individual pardons wholesale to those Confederate grandees who feared expropriation of their property. Johnson's change emboldened them and threatened to dash the hopes of the freed people. But that change in policy proved to be a tonic for rebuilding, especially for the holy trinity of iron, tobacco, and wheat production. Joseph Reed Anderson was a beneficiary of Johnson's reversal. He was a Confederate general whose Tredegar Iron Works made cannons for the South. I doubt if he wore that uniform when he went to the White House to ask for a pardon. With pardon in hand, Anderson built Tredegar into the largest employer in the city. Another who received a coveted pardon was James Thomas, Jr., looking almost cherubic here in this pre-war daguerreotype, holding the source of his wealth, a sheaf of dried tobacco leaves and a plug of chewing tobacco. His factories made him the richest man in town before the war. A lot of his property went up in smoke, but he quickly rebuilt his factories and his fortune. In all, by December of 1865, workers had put 120 new buildings under construction. But recall that hundreds had burned, maybe as many as 1,000. As rebuilding of the burnt district began, the black population developed a parallel society. They emerged from the shadow of slavery with a network of institutions, the family, the church, and an array of self-help organizations. The black church was the central backbone of this phenomenon. In Richmond, the leading example was First African Baptist Church on Broad Street. With its network of contacts beyond the city, it helped reunite families. With its schools, it supported the universal thirst for education that showed itself in the first week after the fire. Another school for black children occupied Chimborazo, the site of the former Confederate military hospital complex east of town. These schools attracted teachers from the North, like Edmonia Lewis. She was a shrewd African-American sculptor who rocketed to fame in Northern abolition circles. Only 21 years old, she put her career on hold in August to come to Richmond to teach formerly newly freed children. In frustration, though, she left for Europe after only a few weeks. She lamented that, quote, the land of liberty had no room for a colored sculptor. Congressional elections in the fall prefigured conflict to come. Many Southern states sent former Confederates as representatives to Washington. Virginia was not as blatant, but Congress refused to seat any Southern congressman. That meant Virginia would have no representation in Washington as Republicans increasingly clashed with the Johnson administration. But affairs at the state and local level took a marked contrast to the national scene. That's because the Army gradually ceded control of the state and local government back to the former establishment. And in elections to the General Assembly, voters returned men who represented that former establishment. In Richmond, Governor Pierpont's middle way, always a sickly plant, withered and died. The divisions in society and the futility of his position were on display at a reception at the governor's mansion in February. The governor's mansion is shown here in a picture taken the previous spring. Members of the conservative establishment attended, like former Mayor Joseph Mayo. Also present were their antagonists, General Terry and some of the white unionists. You can't imagine what the conversations were like between these people under the governor's glittering chandeliers. A larger group of Richmonders were not invited, and they meant to be heard. In January, the black community began planning a parade to mark the anniversary of April the 3rd, 1865. Newspapers warned them against offending their white employers. Some of those employers even threatened to fire any worker who participated. In response, the organizing committee distributed this poster around town. It read, "The colored people of the city of Richmond would most respectfully inform the public that they do not intend to celebrate the failure of the Southern Confederacy, as it has been stated in the papers of this city, but simply as a day on which God was pleased to liberate their long-oppressed race." It's amazing that this flimsy piece of paper has survived. They were tacked up on buildings around town, but one of them survives in Charlie Bryan's Virginia Historical Society, and you can read it today. An unequivocal answer to the poster came 3 days before the parade. That's when arsonists burned down the Second African Baptist Church where the parade was being planned. Despite this ominous warning, the parade came off as planned without incident. 10,000 spectators queued to watch. First in the line of march came 60 mounted black men in uniform. More than 1,000 marchers followed. They represented the charitable organizations that African Americans had founded in secret before the war and expanded in the years since. The parade ended at the Washington statue on Capitol Square, where the crowd heard speeches from their leaders. The keynote speaker, James Honeycutt, was a Baptist minister and newspaper editor with a grim face and alarming hairstyle. His newspaper, The New Nation, was the only journal in town to speak up for equal rights for all citizens regardless of race. But if they asked a white man to give the main address, the organizers made sure to include other speakers of their own race, including the Reverend Peter Randolph. He had been born into slavery in Virginia, but was manumitted and went north. He returned after the war as pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. A heckler in the crowd demanded to know what his policy was. Unruffled, Randolph smoothly replied, "Freedom to all mankind." Another event offered a different perspective a few weeks later. That happened when the white women of Richmond established the Ladies' Memorial Associations, one for Hollywood Cemetery and one for Oakwood Cemetery. It was no fluke that the women held their first remembrance ceremonies immediately after the Black Parade. Another factor prompted the women to act. The federal government began creating national cemeteries in Virginia. They were meant to honor the soldiers in blue. But barring those cemeteries to the remains of Southern soldiers implied they were without honor, and that implication rankled. These carefully designed cemeteries, like this one, put to shame the pitiful state of Confederate soldiers' graves where rude wooden headboards rotted in the heavy Virginia clay. Despite lack of money, the Ladies' Memorial Associations were determined to correct that neglect. The first Confederate Memorial Day at Hollywood took place on May 31st, 1866. The majority of white Richmonders participated. They formed a slow procession to the cemetery behind a brass band. 23 militia companies marched as well. Some even carried Confederate flags. The catharsis of this shared experience renewed their hopes for the future. That first Confederate Memorial Day began the long romance of commemoration that defined white Richmond's devotion to the Southern cause. These two different emblematic ways of remembering the war, the Black Parade emphasizing emancipation, and the white commemoration of Southern dead, coupled with support for the Confederacy, set the stage for conflicting interpretations of the past for years to come. Later that summer, secessionist editor Edward Pollard, tempestuous, prone to violence, and tetchy about honor, gave a name to Confederate defiance with his book. Long awaited, The Lost Cause narrated the rise and fall of the Southern Republic down to its fiery Richmond-centric ending on April 3, 1865, he wrote, "All the hopes of the Southern Confederacy were consumed like a scroll in the fire." He championed the righteousness of the Confederacy, the superiority of the South, and the correctness of white man's rule. If the journalist gave the cause a name with his eponymous title, Governor Wise gave it eloquent voice. Defiant, theatrical, and unrepentant, Wise spoke at a reunion of the Richmond Light Infantry Blues militia the same time as the first Confederate Memorial Day. He proclaimed that the Southern cause was, quote, "the cause of civil and constitutional liberty, which must and will be victorious throughout the United States." Now, at the same time that Wise and Pollard looked to the past and promoted the lost cause in summer 1866, rebuilding and cultural change accelerated in the city. This, after all, was the summer of great excitement. Excitement about the first transatlantic telegraph line. It was the internet, or the AI of the age. It was also the summer when the craze for the new sport of baseball swept Richmond. Police had to shoo kids off the streets to keep them from playing in the roads. And it was the summer when the first modern iron front buildings were erected, like these on Main Street. The Richmond Tobacco Exchange and the Chamber of Commerce were founded. The rebuilt bridge for the Richmond and Petersburg Railroad opened. The Medical College of Virginia graduated its first post-war class. The guiding light of MCV was Dr. Hunter Holmes McGuire. The theater revived too, the legitimate theater, not just the slapstick vaudeville acts that had cropped up right after the fire. Ida Vernon had been the darling of the Confederate stage. She'd watched her house burn on April the 3rd and went on to a 6-decade career in acting, mainly in New York. But she often came back to Richmond, the Richmond stage, where she'd been happiest. Despite the energy apparent in rebuilding the city and its social and cultural institutions, uncertainty about politics remained. Now, some head-spinning changes took place, so hold on to your hats. First, Congress passed a series of Reconstruction Acts. These divided the former Confederate states into 5 military districts. And Virginia had the distinction of being a military district all to itself. The Reconstruction Acts mandated referendums for state constitutional conventions. In Richmond, the election generated great enthusiasm among the black population because this was the first time black men could vote. A lecture at the state capitol during the campaign for the referendum illustrates how much times had changed. Abolitionist Frances Harper spoke in the House of Delegates. Her lecture asserted that the great social changes that the nation had just experienced were incomplete until America was truly colorblind. Her presence in the Capitol represents a remarkable development. 2 months after she spoke, Richmonders voted to call the Constitutional Convention. The enthusiasm of black people and the indifference of white people determined the outcome. Radicals won all 5 districts in the city and a majority statewide. The result belatedly galvanized white Richmond to form the Conservative Party, but they were too late to alter the Constitutional Convention. Delegates to the convention elected Judge Underwood, the scourge of white Richmond, as the president of the convention. It drafted a remarkably forward-looking document. It provided for a strong governor, votes for black men, and free public schools. But it also barred former Confederates from voting. Now, another twist of fortune came next with John Schofield. He was the conservative general in charge of Military District Number 1, and he refused to allow this draft constitution to be put to a vote. So Virginia continued in political limbo for another year. But this state of affairs couldn't last. It prolonged the uncertainty that hung over politics, it denied African Americans their promised rights, and it was bad for business. The next year, a compromise grand bargain broke the impasse. Under it, the new Constitution was revised and finally approved. It now said that all men, black as well as white, including former Confederates, could vote and stand for office. So, a half loaf for each side. The first election under the new Constitution chose a conservative Republican as governor, Gilbert Walker, and conservative domination of the General Assembly, but black men now sat in the legislature. I'll close with the example of one family that showed the complexity of the society Richmonders inherited from the pre-war era. Gustavus Adolphus Myers had helped build Richmond as an enterprising lawyer and company director. He sat on city council for 3 decades. He was president of 2 Jewish congregations, and he was a leader of the Virginia Historical Society. But it was in his person, more than in any civic role, that Myers most intimately embodied the legacy of slavery. Remember that biracial youth who raised the first American flag over the Capitol? He was Myers' grandson. As a young man, Myers had formed a relationship with a free woman of color, Nellie Forrester. They produced a son, Richard Gustavus Forrester, and it was his son who raised the first flag on April the 3rd, 1865. Forrester, the father, this man, was a founding member of the Colored Men's Equal Suffrage League. He served on the city's school board, and he was a marshal in the parade celebrating passage of the 15th Amendment, enshrining in the U.S. Constitution the right of black men to vote. 5 years had now passed since the Great Fire. Since then, Richmond had changed beyond all recognition. This skyline from the early 1870s shows how comprehensively the burnt district had been rebuilt. The city changed not just in its physical aspect. The demons unleashed by racial animosity augured ill for the future. But if we want to understand the people of our city in the first few years after the war, we should keep this in mind. They couldn't see the grimmer future that followed later in the century: Jim Crow legislation, disfranchisement, and all the rest. The first election under the new Constitution restored the traditional establishment in the city and the state, but it didn't undo the enormous strides African Americans had made over their past circumstances. They can now own property, sit on juries, vote, and run for office. Though a minority, 29 black men served in the new General Assembly. It's important to remember that brief period, a fragile period of biracial democracy, a time when white politicians were compelled to compete for black votes. None of those Richmonders, black or white, knew what would happen next week or next month in their own time, any more than we can know what will happen next in our own day. Thank you very much.
Well, that was wonderful, Nelson, and we're going to take questions. And remember, you have to talk into this thing. And 2 of us, the Sallys, are doing this. Do you have any questions? Oh, good. And
Sally was afraid there'd be no questions.
well, I'm ready to make them up. So, and speak into the mic because I think I forgot you. You're on TV, and people all over Cedarfield are
Oh,
seeing
great.
this.
Well, what a wonderful service you have done for all of us in documenting this history. And I'm very interested in how in the world, in the first 5 years after the fire, Richmonders were able to finance the recovery, because weren't they still operating with the Confederate currency?
Well, they weren't, the Confederate currency was worthless. Some of the industrialists, they had business contacts all over the North, and some of them had contacts in London, and Joseph Reed Anderson, I mentioned, and a couple of others, kept sterling accounts in London during the war, so they had real money at the end of the war. And a lot of northern businessmen saw opportunities here and came down and loaned money in partnership with southern businessmen. And they quickly created banks. All the banks burned, but northern banks came down and helped reopen banks to make loans. But it took a while, because remember, they had the bad luck that all the records burned. Insurance records burned, property records burned. You know, during the Civil War, the Confederate government encouraged counties, outlying counties, to send their records to Richmond for safekeeping, and they put them in the one building on Capitol Square that burned. So there were a lot of obstacles, but so that meant it really was quite an achievement 5 years later to produce that.
Okay,
Charlie.
Nelson, great to have you out here, and your message is quite profound. But one of the things I'd like for you to address is the collections of the Virginia Historical Society.
You don't have a vested interest in that, do you?
No, I did, but it's unusual how it was preserved.
Well, I used the collections at the Historical Society extensively for this book and for Richmond Burning. And it's amazing that they had survived. Some of them were burnt in the fire. Some of the trustees had put them in their safe deposit box for safekeeping, and they got burned. But most of them, I think, survived. And since that time, all the successors to that Historical Society in 1865 collected family papers and business records. And we owe a debt of gratitude to all those people. And one of them is you, Charlie. You managed to augment those collections wonderfully in your tenure there, including there was one Civil War collection, the Sneeden collection, that we acquired 1,000 watercolors and a 5,000-page diary kept by a Union soldier who was in prison in Richmond during the war. And Charlie and I got 2 books out of that.
Nelson, it's always interesting to note what a wartime upheaval does to society and the ideals within it. The lady that you mentioned here, Dr. Mary Walker, at one point subsequently received the Army's Medal of Honor.
Yeah.
So designated then. I'm not sure it's the same as it is now. But can you give us a little more information as to what the award was for?
I don't know that story. I know that she did receive the Medal of Honor, and I think it was revoked. But I don't know the circumstances. She was a surgeon in, I think it was an Ohio regiment, and that was unusual for a woman to be given a commission in a regiment. So that set her apart. But she was really better known for campaigning for more looser fitting garments for women. She didn't, she objected to these tightly corseted fashions.
For good reasons. Nelson, you have friends come from the north, and one of their first questions after a couple of weeks will be, Sally, I didn't study the Civil War much. In school, it just didn't happen. It was like 2 weeks maximum. And now I'm in Richmond, and I'm really confused. I thought we, the Yankees, won that war, and I thought it was over. So that summarizes some of the idea of what is the lost cause and why. And I had, like, is there a book that we can read? Because I think a lot of us in the room, even if we were born in South, do not understand the hatred that could last, could be bred for 150 years. So what do you think?
What's the question?
A good book about the lost cause. Why is it so strong that it lasts, so many years? And what do you see as a good definition of what caused the lost cause? Is it universal around the country that people carry this kind of feeling for so many years?
I think the racial issue enters into it and complicated. If it had been a civil war just between two white ethnic groups, things might have developed differently, but I just have to, that's just a gut feeling. There are a lot of books on the aftermath of the war, but you have one close at hand that you could read.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
there's a chapter there on that development of the lost cause.
Yes.
It really only, it got started, his book came out in '66, so very soon after the war, Southerners needed to feel positive, and they did that by building up their recollection of the Confederacy as a good thing. And sometimes when I give a talk, people say, did slavery cause the Civil War, or is it states' rights? And I said the answer is yes, because they're inseparable.
Yes. Questions? Thank you very much. Did you? I wanted to, of course, thank Nelson so much because this is a rock star for us to have today. And the library committee decided to have 2 events this spring. One was to bring Nelson. One was to bring storytellers. So, an extension of our library. And so I would really appreciate if y'all would tell us during the year some local authors or someone that you think would be good for us to bring next year, including entertainment, people that know how to tell a good story, which, of course, Nelson knows how to do. Nelson is a brilliant writer, and if you haven't read his book, you should. And also, I just wanted to say to you, this has just been a wonderful event, and I'm just so glad that so many of you showed up, because it always is you're on pins and needles till you see all the chairs filled up. So thank you for coming.
Thank you, Sally.